It's late now. The room is quiet. Maybe a soft breeze brushes your cheek from an open window, or the hum of a fan keeps the air gently moving. Somewhere in the distance, the day fades into silence. And in this stillness, a story begins, not loud or dramatic, but quiet and deep. The kind of story you might miss if you weren't listening closely. Tonight, I want to take you on a journey, not to kingdoms of power or empires of war, but to the edges of memory, to the forgotten corners of history where soft lives once bloomed, even if no one wrote them down. This is the story of people who have always been among us. People born with what we now call Down syndrome. They didn't have names for it back then. There were no medical words, no genetic explanations, no diagnoses. Just children who arrived into the world looking or acting a little different. And a world that responded in all the ways humans know how, with wonder, with confusion, with love, with fear. Long before medicine, before science, before the idea that difference could be categorized or treated, there was only the raw experience of being human. And when a child was born who didn't speak as quickly, who walked a little later, whose eyes held a softer, slower gaze, what did people see? What did they feel? Did they whisper to each other in concern? Or did they cradle that child just the same, kiss their forehead, and sing to them in the same lullabies? In a quiet field in France, buried beneath centuries of earth and silence, a child was found. Not recently, but their remains, discovered in 2014, were over 1,500 years old. The bones were fragile, small, but the shape of the skull and the size of the nasal bridge gave away a secret. This child had Down syndrome. That alone was rare to find in archaeology. But it wasn't the condition that made this discovery so powerful. It was the burial. The child had been laid to rest with care. Just like others in the community, no signs of harm, no indication of rejection. The grave was simple, but not isolated. The body had been placed in alignment with cultural rituals, suggesting that whoever this child was, they were accepted, seen, loved perhaps. And that changes something, doesn't it? In a world we often imagine as brutal and unknowing, someone long ago took the time to bury a child who was different with dignity. They didn't cast the child aside. They didn't hide them in shame. They placed them in the earth with the same tenderness any parent might feel. And that tells us something important. Compassion is older than science. Understanding might change. But love has always found a way to speak, even when the words didn't exist. That child buried quietly so many centuries ago is not the only one. In the Andes, far from France, archaeologists uncovered another ancient grave, a child. Again with similar features. Once more, the burial showed care, reverence, not abandonment, but belonging. These are just glimpses. A few rare moments where time and science and luck come together to reveal something about the past. But even glimpses matter, because they show us that Down syndrome is not modern. It has always existed, quietly woven into the fabric of the human story. And so have the responses: compassionate, fearful, confused, gentle. In many ancient cultures, when someone was born different, whether in body, mind, or behavior, they were often seen through a spiritual lens. There were no hospitals. There were no charts, only myths, only meaning. A child who didn't speak or move differently might be thought of as touched by gods, or cursed by spirits, or carrying the weight of some ancient fate. In some places, such children were brought to temples. In others, they were hidden. Some were honored. Others were feared. And in many cases, their lives weren't theirs. They became symbols, omens, signs, their humanity blurred by stories people told about them. But still, there were moments, quiet, unnoticed, undocumented, where a mother picked up her child with gentleness, where a father helped them walk slowly across a courtyard, where a sister held their hand as they watched the stars. Moments that didn't make it into history books, but lived in the folds of daily life, in lullabies, in the shape of a hand reaching out, in silence shared without needing explanation. We like to imagine the past as harsh and cold, and often it was. But not always. Sometimes, even without understanding, people chose tenderness, not out of duty, not because they had language for sure, inclusion, but because something in them recognized something in the child, something familiar, something worthy. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a village. Maybe it's set along a river. The sun is warm, the air smells of soil and smoke. A child sits near the fire, their movements slower, their gaze dreamy. They're not given chores like the others, but they are not cast aside. An elder sings to them, a sibling shares food with them. They're part of the rhythm, not outside of it. Is it real? We don't know. But it's possible. And sometimes, possibility is enough to guide the heart. What we do know, what the bones tell us, what the burial patterns confirm, is that people with Down syndrome have always been here. Not as anomalies, not as mistakes, but as part of the human family from the beginning. And while we may never know their names, their voices, their thoughts, we know their presence. And presence matters. It matters because for so long, their stories were left out. Their lives not recorded, their images not painted, their names not spoken. But they were here, and their lives, however brief, however different, were real, lived, felt. And when someone took the time to dig a grave, to place a small body carefully into the ground, to mark the site with ritual or stone, that was love. Or at least it was care. And care is the beginning of everything. So as we begin this long, slow journey through history together, let's hold on to that thought, that before there were specialists or services, before there were rights or recognition, there were still people who saw the face of a child and chose not to turn away. Let's remember that in forgotten villages, on mountainsides, in sacred caves and crumbled cities, children with Down syndrome were born, were held, were cherished, were lost. That their existence is not a new question. It is an ancient truth. And as you settle deeper into rest, let the rhythm of this story carry you like water carving through stone, like wind brushing past trees. This is not a tale of tragedy. It's not even just a tale of difference. It's a tale of what it means to be human, to be vulnerable, to be seen, or to go unseen and still matter anyway. They were here. They were loved. And their story, at long last, begins to be told. As the world slowly turned and civilizations began to rise. The earliest organized societies, those of ancient Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Greece, and Rome, brought with them not just laws and monuments, but myths, symbols, and systems of belief that shaped how people saw everything, including human difference. In a time when there were no blood tests or diagnostic manuals, when medicine was little more than herbs, rituals, and observation, a child born with a gentler face, slower movements, or a unique way of being in the world would not have been labeled, but would have almost certainly been noticed. And the way they were seen would vary wildly depending on where they were born, what gods their people worshipped, and what stories those people told themselves about the soul. In ancient Greece, a place of logic and myth coexisting side by side, physical or cognitive differences were often interpreted through the lens of fate. Life was not random, it was governed by divine forces, by threads spun by the fates, by omens sent from Olympus. A child who didn't behave like others might be seen as the bearer of a message, or as someone touched by gods, whether in blessing or in punishment. The philosopher Pythagoras believed in reincarnation, the transmigration of the soul, and in some circles, there was the thought that such children carried ancient wisdom from lives before, cloaked now in unusual forms. But for every whisper of reverence, there were also shadows. In city-states like Sparta, where strength, conformity, and physical perfection were prized above all. Infants born with clear deformities or developmental differences were often abandoned to the elements. The image of babies left in the cold on Mount Taygetus is well known, though scholars debate how widespread the practice truly was. Still, the idea lingers that some lives, even in their first breath, were deemed not fit to continue. Across the Mediterranean, the Romans inherited many Greek beliefs but added their own layers of law, order, and empire. In Roman households, the paterfamilias, the male head of the family, had legal authority to accept or reject a newborn. It was not unheard of for children perceived as unusual to be quietly removed from the family unit, given to slaves to raise in isolation, or sent away entirely. Yet Rome, like Greece, was not consistent. In wealthier homes, children with visible differences might be kept, even nurtured, particularly if their behavior was gentle or charming. Roman society made room for diversity, but only when it did not threaten the order or dignity of the household. And all the while, their lives remained undocumented, unnamed in the records of war and politics, seen only in glimpses through art, poetry, and rumor. Meanwhile, in the golden sands of ancient Egypt, where the sun was a god and the river Nile, the breath of life itself, difference was more often wrapped in the sacred. Egyptian religion embraced a world full of signs. Dreams, stars, birthmarks, everything meant something. Some children born with physical or intellectual differences were believed to be chosen, sent by the gods with a special purpose. Certain temple rituals even included individuals with what we might now call disabilities, believed to have unique access to the divine. The god Bez, for instance, protector of households and childbirth, was depicted with dwarfism, a visible departure from the idealized forms of other gods. He was celebrated, invoked, and loved. Still, reverence did not always mean equality. Outside the temple walls, families likely faced uncertainty, especially if their child could not perform typical labor or learn traditional roles. But the idea that a person could be different and still carry spiritual power that was present, that mattered. In ancient India, spiritual philosophy was deeply interwoven with daily life, and the concept of karma, the idea that the soul's past actions shaped its current form, played a central role in understanding difference. A child born with unusual characteristics might be seen as the result of past life choices, either their own or their parents'. In some traditions, this interpretation carried shame. In others, it offered meaning, even honor. Certain texts speak of those born into this life not as punishment, but as teachers, souls with special missions to awaken compassion or humility in others. The complexity of Hindu cosmology allowed for multiple truths to coexist. A child could be seen as both a burden and a blessing, as both fragile and holy. Within this spiritual framework, families might find solace, even pride, in their child's presence, though that didn't guarantee they would be treated fairly by society at large. In cultures where storytelling held more weight than science, meaning was assigned quickly. A child who looked different sparked questions. Had the gods sent a sign? Was this child sacred or cursed? Was this a test? A punishment? A gift? The answers depended less on the child than on the stories the culture told itself. And those stories, passed down through generations, carried immense power. In some societies, people with noticeable differences were believed to possess second sight, the ability to see things others could not. They became oracles, seers, or symbolic figures in festivals and rituals. In others, they were feared, hidden away, or treated with suspicion, their condition seen as contagious, their presence as dangerous to the balance of the community. Yet, even within these symbolic roles, there remained something deeply human. A mother's touch, a father's worry, a sibling's curiosity, a village healer's attempt to soothe. These are the moments history forgets because they leave no inscription. But they are real. They happen in every culture, across every century. The child who cries in the night and is comforted, not because of what they are believed to represent, but simply because they are a child. And while we don't have definitive accounts of children with Down syndrome in ancient texts, the clues are there. In art, we sometimes see figures with rounded faces, almond-shaped eyes, and expressions of calm. In myth, we read of characters born under strange stars, their fates veiled in mystery. And in ritual, we find patterns of inclusion and exclusion, of drawing close and pushing away, that suggest a long, complicated history of trying to make sense of what we now understand as genetic difference. There's a strange comfort in knowing that people have been wrestling with these questions for thousands of years. That the tension between fear and love, between ignorance and care, is not new. It is ancient. It belongs to all of us. And in every era, in every village, there were those who turned away, and those who drew closer. Those who saw a child and thought, "Why is this happening to me?" And others who thought, "How lucky I am that this child chose me." So much depended on the culture, but even more depended on the moment, on the particular mix of beliefs, personalities, and circumstances that shaped one person's reaction to another. In one town, a child with Down syndrome might be raised like any other, tucked into bed at night, fed and sunned to, adored for their gentleness. In another, that same child might be shunned, institutionalized, or quietly forgotten. There was no universal answer, no consistent path. Only the constant, that these children were born, that they breathed, that they lived among us, however briefly, however invisibly, and the choices made around them, by parents, by midwives, by priests or elders, wrote a kind of invisible story. A story that mostly went untold, but not unfelt. In the absence of written records, we must listen to the spaces in between. 2. The shape of a burial, to the wear of footsteps near a cradle, to the way certain figures were painted with halos in one century and horns in another. We listen not with our ears, but with imagination and with compassion, because that's how we recover lost voices. That's how we remember what history tried to erase. The classical world, with all its beauty and brutality, its sculptures and scrolls and soaring temples, was not always kind. But in the cracks, there is light. A whisper of a mother's lullaby. A flicker of a candle beside a crib. A grainy mural on a temple wall showing a figure who looks just a little different, but still stands in the crowd. They were there, and they mattered. Even if no one wrote their names. As the ancient empires slowly faded into memory and the classical world gave way to something darker, something quieter, the Middle Ages descended across Europe like a long hush. From the fall of Rome to the rise of feudal kingdoms, nearly 1,000 years passed, marked not by the marble of philosophers, but by the stone of cathedrals and the whisper of prayer. It was a time when the church stood above kings, when scripture held more power than law, and when anything unusual was seen not through the eyes of science, but through the heavy lens of faith. In this world, a child born with Down syndrome entered into a silence deeper than mere absence of sound. They entered into a world of symbols, of fears, of divine mysteries and invisible punishments. Their existence was not measured by biology or ability, but by what people believed about sin, the soul, and the unknown. In villages scattered across forests and fields, where news traveled slowly and myths were stronger than maps, the birth of a child with visible differences could stir unease. Whispers passed between midwives and mothers. Had the mother sinned during pregnancy? Had the father offended the saints? Was the child a punishment, a test, or a dark omen? There were no answers, only interpretations, often shaped by sermons and superstition. And so, without understanding, people turned to fear. In some towns, such a child might be hidden, kept indoors for life, not out of cruelty alone, but from a desperate desire to protect them, or to shield the family from shame. Windows stayed shuttered, Neighbors learned not to ask. The child grew up in half-light, surrounded only by the familiar voices of kin, yet never fully touched by the world outside. In other cases, especially among devout families or those connected to religious communities, children with intellectual or physical differences were given to the church. Monasteries and convents served as both sanctuary and seclusion. The church, for all its dogma, held a space for those seen as weak, ill, or broken. Religious orders were tasked with care, not out of progressiveness, but out of duty, and sometimes genuine compassion. Within those stone walls, a child with Down syndrome might be bathed, clothed, and taught to pray. They might be given simple tasks, gathering herbs, assisting in the garden, or helping in the kitchen. Their life was narrow, yes, but perhaps safe, perhaps peaceful. But always apart, there were exceptions, rare but real, that glowed like small candles in the long medieval dark. Some monks and nuns saw these children not as cursed, but as innocent, pure souls, closer to God than the rest of humanity, untouched by the corruption of the world. Writings from a few religious communities refer to such individuals with tenderness, even awe, calling them God's little ones, or the blessed simple. In these rare moments, difference was not feared, but revered. And within cloistered gardens and echoing chapels, perhaps a child once laughed, sang a single note over and over, or smiled silently while touching the edge of a stained glass window, and someone saw beauty in that. Someone believed it was enough, but for most, life in the medieval world was not kind. Without a name for their condition, without a voice in any institution, people with Down syndrome existed in a space that history rarely visits. They were not written about because they were not seen as historical. They were not granted roles in society because society did not know what to do with them. They were not saints, soldiers, or scholars. They were invisible, or nearly so. Yet we know they were there. Not because they left records, but because now and then, a parish ledger notes an unnamed, slow child. Or a burial site reveals bones that speak a different story. Or a medieval painting shows an angel with features that feel familiar, rounded cheeks, a short nose, eyes that tilt upward in gentle mystery. Was the artist painting someone they knew? Or were they reaching unconsciously for a face they had seen but never understood? We cannot say, but the image lingers, and it invites us to imagine. Imagine a mother, kneeling at the side of a cradle, whispering prayers for her son who does not speak. She wraps his hands in wool, strokes his hair, and watches as he gazes upward, smiling at light flickering through the rafters. She doesn't know why he is different, but she loves him. And that love is quiet, fierce, and without reward. Imagine a monk who teaches a boy with Down syndrome to recite a single Latin phrase, over weeks, over months, and rejoices the first time the boy gets it right. Imagine a village girl who sits beside her brother each morning and shows him how to braid straw, knowing he will never sell baskets at the market, but still proud of each clumsy loop. These small acts are the fabric of the forgotten, the unwritten stories that make up the hidden majority of history. Not kings or crusades, not saints or sinners, just people doing their best with what they had and what they did not understand. And yes, there was cruelty too. Laughter in the streets when someone different passed by. Isolation, abuse, the use of the word fool not as comedy, but condemnation. In royal courts, jesters were sometimes chosen because of their differences, paraded for entertainment, mocked behind brocade curtains. Their pain turned into spectacle. Their minds misunderstood, became material for jokes. It is a hard truth to face, but face it we must. Not every act of survival is a victory. Not every story ends in kindness. Yet even in that, there is meaning. Because the presence of these individuals, though unnamed, though uncelebrated, reminds us that the human story has always been shared. That the margins are part of the page. that the people left out of the scrolls still walked the same earth, under the same sun, heard the same birds, and dreamed their own dreams, however fragile or unspoken. In the late Middle Ages, as towns grew and guilds formed, and Europe crept toward the Renaissance, the idea of what was normal began to shift. But for those with cognitive disabilities, life remained largely the same: quiet, small, hidden. The difference was perhaps that the questions grew louder. Was this child sent by God? Was this a soul in need of healing? Or simply someone who would never fit into the growing order of the world? No one knew. And in the absence of answers, silence remained the default response. Still, within that silence, there were families who chose differently, who kept their children close, who did not explain or apologize, who simply lived their lives day by day, feeding, dressing, comforting, and loving someone who the world refused to see. And in doing so, they planted seeds. Seeds of resistance, of compassion, of slow change. Seeds that would one day grow into movements, rights, and recognition. But in the Middle Ages, they were just families. Ordinary, unnoticed, and profoundly brave. So when we look back on this long chapter of shadow and superstition, let us not see only darkness. Let us see the flicker of candles, the folds of a worn blanket, the hush of a song sung in secret. Let us remember that even in the most rigid and fearful times, some hearts stayed open. Some hands remained gentle. Some stories, though never told, were lived with grace. They were here, they mattered. Even when history forgot to say so. As the world slowly awoke from the long slumber of the Middle Ages, a different kind of light began to spread, not the golden glow of cathedral candles, or the soft hush of monastic chants, but the sharp, curious beam of reason. It was the age of enlightenment, when thinkers and scientists began asking new questions about nature, society, and the human mind. Cities grew louder, streets busier, books more plentiful. And amid this rising tide of knowledge and exploration, children with Down syndrome were still being born, still smiling their quiet smiles, still puzzling those around them, still living lives mostly undocumented. But the world around them was changing, and with change came new ways of seeing, and sometimes new ways of misunderstanding. For the first time, scholars began to document observable patterns in people with similar traits. Physicians noted differences in facial features, speech development, and learning pace. They used words like idiocy, feeble-mindedness, or cretinism, terms that today sound cruel but were, at the time, considered scientific classifications. These labels were not meant to harm, though they often did. They were attempts to name what had always existed, but had never been defined. And in naming, something subtle happened. Difference became diagnosis. The child who once might have been seen as touched by God, or simply slow, was now a subject of medical interest. A puzzle to be solved, a deviation to be studied. Hospitals and asylums began to emerge, not only as places of healing, but as institutions of separation. In towns and cities across Europe, families with children who did not conform to expected developmental norms were encouraged, sometimes gently, sometimes forcefully, to send them away, out of sight, out of the home, out of public life. These asylums were not always cruel in intent. Some were founded with genuine hopes of care, structure, and safety. But they were also places of confinement, of routine, of silence. Within stone walls and iron gates, countless individuals lived out their days in anonymity, their names recorded in patient ledgers, their personalities flattened into case notes. Among them, certainly, were those with Down syndrome, though still without that name. They were described instead by behavior, by appearance, by perceived deficiency. And yet, within those walls, lives were still lived. Hands still reached for warmth. Eyes still searched for connection. There were friendships, fleeting joys, tiny rebellions of spirit that no report ever captured. A girl might have sung the same melody each morning. A boy might have arranged stones in careful patterns, day after day. A nurse, perhaps weary from long shifts, might have paused to smile at one of them, to smooth a blanket, to offer a biscuit without being asked. These moments, though undocumented, mattered. They were not enough, but they were real. Outside the institutions, in homes where children with differences remained with their families, the experience was shaped by class, culture, and luck. Wealthier families, particularly in Enlightenment-era France and England, sometimes kept such children quietly within the household, cared for by servants or tutors, not spoken of in public, but not discarded either. In paintings from the 18th century, if you look closely, you might see a child in the background seated, quiet, eyes turned away. They are not named, but they are there. Working-class families, with fewer resources and greater pressure to survive, often faced impossible choices. A child who could not contribute to the labor of the home or field might be seen as a burden, even when deeply loved. Yet stories linger of siblings who protected, of mothers who refused to send their children away, of fathers who carried them on their backs through city streets, pretending nothing was different. In 1866, something shifted. A British physician named John Langdon Down published a paper describing a group of patients he had observed, individuals who shared common features: almond-shaped eyes, rounded faces, and a certain gentleness of manner. He used the term mongoloid, based on now debunked racial theories common at the time, reflecting the era's troubling entanglement of science and prejudice. Yet despite its flaws, Down's work marked the first attempt to classify what would later be known as Down syndrome. His descriptions were not devoid of compassion. He wrote of the dignity he saw in his patients, the joy they expressed, the uniqueness of their personalities. At a time when most viewed cognitive disability as shameful or pitiable, Down saw humanity. He ran a private institution where he encouraged music, art, and structured learning. It was not perfect, but it was something different. A recognition, however faint, that these lives deserved more than neglect. The name Down syndrome would not become official until the 20th century, long after the doctor's death. But the fact that a name existed at all changed the way people thought about the condition. It gave it form. It made it visible, and with visibility came both opportunity and risk. To be seen is not always to be accepted. For some, diagnosis brought clarity, resources, and better care. For others, it became a justification for exclusion, for segregation, for the belief that some lives were simply less worthy. As the Industrial Revolution roared to life, cities became engines of speed and efficiency. People were measured by productivity, by usefulness, by how well they could fit into the cogs of an increasingly mechanized society. For individuals with intellectual disabilities, this was not a world built with them in mind. They were too slow, too different, too unprofitable. And so, they were left behind again. Some remained hidden at home, cared for quietly. Others were sent to ever-growing institutions, often overcrowded and underfunded. And still, amid the clatter of machines and the smoke of factories, they continued to live, to laugh, to feel. Even when forgotten, but here and there, the world shifted. A teacher in Prussia developed basic literacy lessons for simple children. A nun in Ireland taught hymns by repetition and touch. In a village outside Florence, a woman gave her son with Down syndrome a paintbrush and marveled at the colors he chose. These moments were small, private, unrecorded in textbooks. But they happened, and they mattered. Because every act of patience, of belief, of seeing someone not as broken, but as whole in a different way, each of those acts left a mark. By the late 1800s, a quiet movement had begun to stir. Parents began asking questions. Why must their children be hidden? Why must difference mean dismissal? Slowly, painfully, the seeds of advocacy were planted. Still decades away from blooming, but already beginning to root. So as we drift through the Enlightenment and into the modern age, the story becomes more complicated. Knowledge grows, but compassion does not always keep pace. Society begins to name, to measure, to organize difference. But naming is not understanding. And as we will see, the next century would bring both light and shadow, advances in science and horrors in its name. But for now, here in this moment of transition, we pause and remember. They were still here, in houses and hospitals, in gardens and workshops, in drawings pinned to the walls of rooms no one visited, in memories never written down. They were here. The 20th century arrived not with a whisper, but a surge, bursting with inventions, revolutions, and the promises of science. Electricity lit up cities, telephones carried voices across continents, and medicine began reaching further into the body and brain than ever before. For the first time in history, people began living longer, surviving diseases that once claimed whole generations. It felt like anything was possible, like knowledge could solve every problem, if only the right formula could be found. But for those born different, for children with Down syndrome, the dawn of modernity was both a gift and a threat. As doctors gained new tools to see into the body, society began to believe it could also fix the soul or remove what it didn't understand. What had once been wrapped in myth or prayer was now wrapped in diagnosis and prognosis. And too often, the question shifted from how do we care for this child to should this child even live? In the early decades of the century, especially in the West, individuals with Down syndrome were typically institutionalized soon after birth. Parents were told their child would never walk, never talk, never contribute to society. They were advised to forget, to try again. Hospitals did not offer services. Instead, they quietly transferred babies to distant facilities, far from neighborhoods and family gatherings, far from birthday parties and bedtime stories. In these institutions, many of them underfunded, overcrowded, and sterile in every sense of the word, life unfolded in routines devoid of meaning. Children sat in rows, fed and washed on schedules, denied education, affection, or stimulation. They were not called by name, but by number. They wore hand-me-down clothes, shared cribs, and stared at ceilings for hours. And yet, even there, humanity flickered. One child would hum a tune. Another would rock rhythmically, finding comfort in motion. A nurse, though forbidden to grow attached, might stroke a cheek, whisper a nickname, sneak a flower into a pocket on Easter morning. Even in the loneliest places, kindness found cracks to grow in. But this was also the age of eugenics. A belief had taken root that some lives were more valuable than others, that human progress required pruning the so-called weak branches from the tree of humanity. This wasn't hidden, it was policy. In the United States, laws were passed allowing forced sterilizations of individuals deemed unfit, a category that included many with cognitive disabilities. Doctors performed surgeries without consent. Judges approved them. Newspapers praised them. Between the 1920s and 1970s, tens of thousands of people were sterilized in institutions and state homes, many of them teenagers with Down syndrome who never understood what was taken from them. The rationale was chilling, that society could be improved by limiting who was allowed to reproduce. And yet, these programs were considered progressive by many at the time. Science, it seemed, had found a way to silence the parts of humanity it didn't want to hear. In Germany, the ideology turned even darker. Under the Nazi regime, a policy known as Action T4 targeted individuals with disabilities for extermination. Children and adults alike were taken from hospitals and homes, placed in so-called clinics, and killed by injection, starvation, or gas. Families were told their loved ones had died of illness. Medical reports were falsified. And the killing continued quietly until war turned the world's eyes elsewhere. Among those victims were many with Down syndrome, babies, toddlers, teenagers, each one a life that had smiled, cried, reached for comfort, and was deemed unworthy of existence. This was not ancient history. It happened in the same century that sent men to the moon. In the same decades that invented television and cured polio, human beings were systematically erased because they did not fit the vision of a perfect future. And yet, there were those who resisted. Some doctors hid children in back rooms, falsifying records to protect them. Some nuns refused orders, keeping the most vulnerable under the cover of prayer. Some parents fled, choosing exile over betrayal. These small acts of courage saved lives, not many, but enough to remind us that conscience, even when surrounded by cruelty, can still choose differently. After the war, the world began to reckon with what had been done in the name of purity, science, and progress. Slowly, painfully, attitudes began to shift. A new generation of parents refused to hide their children. They demanded better care, better education, better answers. Advocacy groups were formed. Mothers marched into school boards, asking why their sons and daughters were denied entry. Fathers wrote letters to politicians, pleading for resources. And gradually, doors began to open. In the 1950s and 60s, special education programs emerged. Not perfect ones, but a start. Therapists experimented with new methods: repetition, visual learning, gentle speech prompting. Doctors stopped saying they'll never do anything and began asking, what might they be capable of? Hope returned, not as a miracle, but as a question worth pursuing. In 1959, a breakthrough came. A French geneticist named Jérôme Liogne discovered that individuals with what was then called Mongolism had an extra copy of chromosome 21. For the first time, the condition had a clear biological cause. It wasn't bad parenting. It wasn't a curse. It was genetics. The term trisomy 21 was born, and with it, a new chapter in medical understanding. But even this progress came with shadows. Prenatal testing soon followed, and with it, the rise of selective abortion. Once again, the world was offered a choice: to accept difference or to erase it before it began. For some, this new knowledge offered preparation, time to learn and gather support. For others, it became a filter, a way to shape families that looked a certain way, that fit within certain expectations. It is a tension that still lingers today. But even as society struggled with its conscience, individuals with Down syndrome continued to live their lives walking hallways, eating ice cream, spinning in circles beneath autumn trees. They learned to tie shoes, to count coins, to play piano melodies from memory. They giggled at cartoons, hugged their parents tightly, cried when scolded, cheered when praised. Some grew up and fell in love. Others found joy in routines: the daily walk, the favorite sweater, the same song played each morning. And as they lived, their presence did something extraordinary. It softened others, it opened hearts. It challenged what it meant to be valuable. Teachers who had never thought about inclusion began to wonder. Doctors who once gave dire predictions began revising their words. And everywhere, quietly, the people who were once hidden began to be seen, not just as patients or burdens or anomalies, but as people. So the 20th century, for all its darkness, also carried light. A light born not of perfection or policy, but of persistence. Of families who refused to give up. Of teachers who kept trying. Of young adults with Down syndrome who stood on. Stages rode buses, wore graduation robes, and made the world look again. And though the century closed with many battles still ahead, it closed with their faces no longer invisible. The 21st century arrived not with horses or drums, but with signals pulsing through fiber optic cables, with glowing screens and whispered code, with promises of connection and innovation carried on invisible waves. The world grew faster, louder, and smaller all at once. Technology reshaped everything. How we learned, how we loved, how we understood life itself. In this digital age, almost nothing remained hidden. Voices once silenced found microphones. Communities once isolated found each other. Parents no longer had to face the unknown alone. They could type a few words into a search bar and find stories, advice, videos, and most importantly, others who understood. And for those born with Down syndrome, a quiet revolution was unfolding, not in laboratories or courts, but in living rooms and classrooms, on playgrounds and stages, in the everyday places where humanity finally began to see itself more clearly. For the first time, children with Down syndrome were being raised not as secrets, not as burdens to be borne in silence, but as sons and daughters to be cherished out loud. More families chose to keep their babies, to share their smiles on social media, to speak openly about their joys and challenges. Photos of toddlers with almond eyes and contagious giggles began appearing on parenting blogs, in online forums, and even in advertising campaigns. Representation bloomed, not perfectly, not universally, but visibly. Children once erased from brochures and books were now featured in toy catalogs, on cereal boxes, and back-to-school ads. They were no longer symbols of sorrow or objects of pity. They were simply children. And that, in its quiet ordinariness, was radical. Education, too, began to shift. In many parts of the world, inclusive classrooms became more than just a policy. They became a philosophy. Teachers received training. Aides were hired. Curriculum was adapted. Slowly, the walls separating special education from mainstream began to dissolve. A child with Down syndrome might now sit beside their peers, tracing letters, sharing crayons, singing the morning song. Their pace might be different. Their needs might require more attention, but their presence was no longer questioned. It was assumed, expected, valued, and in those classrooms, something magical often happened, not only for the child with the diagnosis, but for those around them. Compassion grew, patience deepened. A class learned not just math and reading, but what it meant to include someone, not because they were the same, but because they were there. As these children grew into teenagers and adults, new frontiers emerged. Programs were developed to teach life skills, job readiness, independent living. Restaurants hired greeters and dishwashers with Down syndrome. Grocery stores welcomed them as shelf stockers and cart collectors. Some found roles in theater, in dance, even on television. Others discovered joy in routines, in structured jobs, in daily walks and familiar faces. Not every life was extraordinary by the world's standards, but that was never the point. What mattered was choice, dignity, the right to be seen not just as someone to care for, but as someone who could contribute, however modestly, to the world around them. Social media, with all its flaws, became an unlikely ally. Parents shared stories not just of milestones, but of meltdowns, medical scares, awkward encounters, and hard-won triumphs. These stories humanized what many still didn't understand. They built bridges between ignorance and empathy. And perhaps most powerfully, self-advocates, adults with Down syndrome, began telling their own stories. They spoke on panels, attended conferences, posted videos, challenged assumptions. They said, "I am here. I am capable. I am not your tragedy." And the world, or at least some corners of it, began to listen. Medical care also improved. Heart surgeries that were once too risky became routine. Therapies started earlier. Speech delays were met with early intervention, not resignation. And families were offered support, sometimes from the moment of diagnosis. But with these advancements came new questions that were not medical, but moral. As prenatal testing became more accurate, more accessible, more expected, the number of pregnancies terminated after a diagnosis of Down syndrome increased in many countries. In Iceland, for instance, the rate approached 100%. In other places, the numbers hovered high. And so a quiet tension formed between celebration and elimination, between a society that claimed to embrace difference and one that, increasingly, chose to prevent it. Some argued that these were private choices. Others worried about the message being sent that a life with Down syndrome was not worth living. And amid the debates, families who had chosen to continue their pregnancies, who had embraced their children with all their complexity, found themselves caught in a strange place, defending not just their children's right to exist, but their value to a world that still measured worth in terms of perfection, efficiency, and ease. But they kept speaking. They kept showing up. They kept loving out loud. Meanwhile, science continued to press forward. Researchers explored gene therapy, chromosomal silencing, pharmacological interventions that might enhance cognition or reduce risk of associated conditions. Some welcomed this work as hopeful. Others feared it echoed old impulses, the desire to fix what was never broken, to normalize what was never meant to be uniform. And so the conversation deepened, as it always must, around difference, identity, and what it means to be human. And through it all, through every policy and protest, every headline and hesitation, the lives themselves continued quietly, tenderly, beautifully. A young woman with Down syndrome sat at a wedding, crying with joy as her sister said, "I do." A teenager practiced dance moves in her bedroom mirror, humming along to Taylor Swift. A boy in Ohio counted down the days until his birthday, then cried when the cake came out because he didn't want the moment to end. A man in South Korea folded napkins at a cafe, grinning each time a customer said thank you. A little girl in Kenya chased a butterfly across her schoolyard, never catching it, never needing to. Each life unique, each life whole. This is not a fairy tale. There are still challenges. Discrimination persists. Access is uneven. Resources are limited. Some families struggle deeply, especially where services are scarce or stigma remains high. Not every story is one of triumph, but more stories are being told. More truths are being named. And that matters, because in the end, what we remember, what we record, what we repeat, these things shape what we believe. For centuries, children with Down syndrome were erased from memory, their names lost to silence. But now they are in the photos, in the footnotes, in the family albums, on the school rolls, in the workforce, on the stage. They are not rare. They are not accidental. They are not broken. They are here. They have always been here. What makes a life worth living? Is it measured in achievements, in intelligence, in independence? Is it found in diplomas framed on walls, in promotions earned, in victories counted? Or is it something quieter, something less easily tallied, like laughter shared at breakfast, a hand held during thunderstorms, a smile that appears for no reason at all? In a world increasingly obsessed with optimization, efficiency, and perfection, these questions press in closer, more urgently than ever. For people with Down syndrome, and for the families who love them, such questions are not abstract. They are woven into daily life, into the decision to send a child to a mainstream school, into the decision to keep them home, into conversations with doctors, with strangers in supermarkets, with well-meaning friends who say too much or too little. And always humming beneath those questions is the quiet truth that worth cannot be measured in spreadsheets. That presence, connection, and kindness may be the deepest forms of meaning we ever know. Around the world, awareness campaigns have bloomed. Marsha's documentaries, social media challenges, and inclusive fashion shows have brought visibility to a group once relegated to shadows. Celebrities with Down syndrome have risen to international stages, acting in films, speaking at conferences, modeling on catwalks. Their faces, their voices, their stories challenge long-held assumptions about what is possible. And yet, not every story needs a spotlight. Sometimes, the most radical visibility is simply being present. Sitting in a cafe, attending a family reunion, graduating high school, going to the grocery store, These are not small things. They are declarations. They say, I exist. I belong. I am part of this world. And yet, challenges remain complex, systemic, and deeply human. In many countries, access to quality education and healthcare still depends on geography, income, and government policy. A child born with Down syndrome in one part of the world may receive therapy, tailored learning plans, and inclusive schooling. Another, born just a few miles or borders away, may receive none of those things. They may be institutionalized, forgotten, or quietly carried through life by a family doing its best with very little support. Even in places with more progressive systems, there are battles to be fought against bureaucracies that move too slowly, against insurance companies that deny coverage, against schools that still see difference as disruption. And then there is stigma, subtle, shifting, stubborn. The way a stranger glances away, the silence in a conversation when a diagnosis is mentioned, the assumption that a life with Down syndrome is somehow less a consolation prize, a detour, a tragedy rewritten as resilience. But it is not a tragedy, it is a story. A human story, full of complexity, tenderness, hardship, joy. Like any other. In many families, the journey begins with grief, not because the child is unloved, but because the world has taught parents to expect one kind of story and then given them another. Dreams must be rewritten. Assumptions must be unlearned. There is mourning, yes, but not for the child, for the map that no longer fits the terrain. And once that grief has passed, whether in weeks or years, something else takes its place. A deeper kind of joy. A joy that is not rooted in comparison, but in presence. In celebrating progress no one else sees. In finding wonder in small victories, a button fastened, a word pronounced clearly, a friend made at school. These moments, invisible to most, become the stars by which a new kind of life is navigated. For the individuals themselves, life unfolds in myriad ways. Some grow up speaking in full sentences, reading chapter books, holding jobs, living semi-independently. Others remain mostly nonverbal, relying on visual cues and routine, requiring assistance in daily tasks. But ability is not the only measure of a life. There is also warmth, sincerity, humor, the capacity to give and receive love in its purest form. Ask anyone who lives with a person with Down syndrome, and they will likely tell you about an affection that is spontaneous and generous, about laughter that bubbles up at unexpected times, about lessons in patience and perspective that no book could ever teach. These are not sentimental exaggerations. They are truths lived out day after day, and as science continues to push forward exploring gene therapies, cognitive enhancers, and even potential chromosomal editing, ethical questions rise to the surface. Should we cure Down syndrome? What would that mean? Who would we be trying to help? Some families dream of medical breakthroughs that could ease heart conditions, improve memory, reduce early onset dementia risk. Others worry that the drive to normalize will erase something essential, that in our quest for efficiency, we may lose a kind of beauty that only exists in difference. These are not questions with easy answers. They require listening to scientists, yes, but also to self-advocates, to families, to those who live the experience from the inside. For it is one thing to observe a life from the outside, and another to inhabit it. One thing, however, becomes clearer with every passing decade. People with Down syndrome are not problems to be solved. They are not unfinished stories or accidental detours. They are whole from the moment they are born. Their lives are not made meaningful by achievements or milestones, but by the same thing that makes any life meaningful: relationship. To be known, to be loved, to be part of something larger than oneself. And that is not rare. That is universal. So as we look around today, at a world more connected than ever, more capable of compassion than at any point in history, We also recognize how much still needs to be done. We see countries where inclusive education is still a dream. We see adults with Down syndrome who, after aging out of school systems, find themselves without work, without community, without purpose. We see healthcare systems that treat symptoms but not souls. And yet, we also see movements small, determined, relentless. We see parents forming advocacy groups. We see teachers rethinking lesson plans. We see employers giving chances. We see siblings who grow up to become policymakers, doctors, therapists, changing the very systems that once failed their families. And above all, we see the individuals themselves, walking, laughing, learning, loving not in spite of their condition, but alongside it, as part of who they are, but not the whole of who they are. Because the truth, the soft and stubborn truth, is this: inclusion is not charity. It is not something granted by the generous to the needy. It is a recognition that we all belong, that none of us are complete without the others, that the mosaic of human life is most beautiful, not when it is uniform, but when it is varied, each piece unique, uneven, irreplaceable. And among those pieces, the lives of people with Down syndrome shine with a light that is quiet, steady, and deeply human. Perhaps one of the most tender truths we ever learn is that love has no requirements. It does not ask for IQ scores, for job titles, for articulate sentences or 5-year plans. It appears quietly in the spaces where presence matters more than performance, and it takes root in relationships that do not follow rules written in policy or expectation. In homes where children with Down syndrome grow, this kind of love becomes the language spoken long before any words are formed. It is in the way a mother adjusts her child's collar without a word, in the way a father lifts his daughter onto his lap after a long day, not because she cannot sit on her own, but because he still sees her as small, as soft as his. It is in the way siblings learn to slow down, to explain things twice, to take pride in teaching instead of competing. It is in the way grandparents beam at school performances, even if the lines are delivered imperfectly or not at all. These are not grand gestures. They are the quiet rituals of belonging. And over time, they shape a reality where the extraordinary becomes ordinary, where love becomes structure, and difference becomes something no longer feared, but folded into the family fabric like a favorite old quilt. But the story doesn't stop inside the home. It stretches outward into schools, workplaces, hospitals, neighborhoods. And in each of those spaces, people with Down syndrome encounter a question that is rarely spoken aloud, but often implied. What are you doing here? It's the question asked in a glance, in an awkward pause, in a hesitant tone. It's the question that surfaces when inclusion is written into law but not yet lived in culture. But when we look closer, we see that the question is misplaced. It should never be asked of the person with the diagnosis. It should be asked of the world around them. What are we doing here if we cannot make space for those who experience life differently? What is the purpose of progress if not to widen the circle of who gets to belong? Progress, after all, is not measured only by GDP or technological leaps. It is measured by tenderness, by the degree to which the vulnerable are protected, not hidden, by whether a child is greeted at school by name or by silence, by whether an adult with Down syndrome can walk into a job interview and be seen not as a liability, but as a person with strengths, quirks, limitations, just like anyone else. And progress is also measured by how we tell stories. For centuries, stories of people with disabilities were told by others, by doctors, by caregivers, by distant observers with clinical pens and detached tones. But now, more than ever, the stories are being reclaimed. People with Down syndrome are writing their own narratives, making their own art, speaking their own truths. A woman in Argentina publishes poetry about the feeling of learning to tie her shoes. A man in Japan creates detailed ink drawings of cityscapes he visits once and remembers forever. A young adult in Canada posts weekly videos about his day-to-day routines, his favorite songs, his dreams for the future. These are not stories of exception. They are stories of existence. And existence, in its quiet persistence, is the most powerful thing of all. Because to exist in a world that once tried to erase you, and to do so with joy, with laughter, with stubborn hope, that is a form of resistance more enduring than any protest. It is a protest that lives in every birthday candle blown out, every subway ride taken alone, every new skill practiced until it sticks. It is not about being inspirational. It is about being undeniable. And this undeniability, once seen, begins to change people. Teachers start to notice different kinds of intelligence. Employers learn to value consistency and kindness as much as speed and charisma. Neighbors become allies. Friends become advocates, and over time a ripple begins. One person, then another, then a community, then a culture. Still, ripples are not waves, and change is not always linear. There are setbacks. There are places where old attitudes linger like fog hospitals, where doctors still speak in hushed tones about quality of life, schools where children are funneled into low expectation, tracks without consultation, media that continues to frame disability as misfortune rather than variation. These are the places where vigilance is needed, where storytelling must continue, where empathy must be cultivated like a fragile plant. Because even the most inclusive environments can grow complacent. They can forget that inclusion is not a destination, but a practice. One that must be renewed daily with intention. And so we keep returning to the lives themselves, to the rhythm of ordinary days. A girl in her 20s gets up early to feed her cat, packs her lunch, and heads off to volunteer at a local shelter. Her tasks are simple: folding towels, organizing supplies, but she does them with care. At lunch, she chats with her coworkers, sometimes telling the same story more than once. They listen anyway. Later, she rides the bus home, waves to her neighbor, and spends the evening watching her favorite cartoon for the 100th time. Is this life less meaningful than any other? Is her joy less bright? Her presence less sacred? These are the quiet reckonings of our time. Because when we measure lives only by productivity or profit, we miss something essential. We miss the human. To live is to feel, to connect, to offer and receive affection, to delight in repetition, to mourn in silence, to laugh out loud at something only you find funny. And people with Down syndrome do all these things, not in rare moments, but daily. Their emotions are not caricatures. Their personalities are not templates. They are as complex, as unpredictable, as richly layered as any of ours. And when we forget this, we not only diminish them, we diminish ourselves. We reduce the vastness of human experience to a narrow corridor. We silence voices that speak in different rhythms, different tones. So let us remember, not only with statistics or legal protections, but with awe. Let us remember that inclusion is not merely about access, it is about invitation. It is about saying, your presence is not just tolerated, it is welcome. Your story is not just allowed, it is needed. Your being here does not disrupt the world. It makes the world whole. And in this remembering, we create not just better policies, but better people. People who know how to sit with difference, how to learn from it, how to grow alongside it. Because the story of Down syndrome is not a footnote. It is a chapter, a song, a thread in the long, messy, beautiful tapestry of what it means to be human. And the more we allow that thread to shine, the stronger the tapestry becomes, not in uniformity, but in color. Not in symmetry, but in depth. And maybe that, more than anything, is the legacy we are being called to write, not one of pity or praise, but of recognition. Of quiet, unwavering recognition. There is something remarkable that happens when you spend enough time beside someone who moves through the world a little differently. At first, you might notice the obvious things: the delayed speech, the shorter attention span, the small hand in yours that lingers just a second longer than most. You may notice how routines are held close like favorite toys, how transitions require patience, how emotions burst forth without warning and just as quickly soften into giggles or stillness. But if you truly stay, you begin to notice something else. You begin to slow down. You begin to soften. You begin to listen not just with your ears, but with your entire being. And over time, this presence begins to undo something in you. Not break it, but unravel it. The urgency, the comparison, the constant demand to be more, do more, prove more. In its place comes a quieter rhythm, one that values moments over milestones, one that treasures being rather than becoming, one that remembers that the purpose of life is not to ascend some imagined ladder, but to sit beside those we love and notice the way sunlight pools across a hardwood floor. Parents often describe this transformation in the most ordinary terms. They'll say, "I became more patient," or "I learned to celebrate the small things." But what they are really describing is a kind of reorientation, a turning away from the frantic forward motion of modern life and a turning toward something deeper, something older. They describe learning to see the world through new eyes that find joy in a Tuesday afternoon walk, in the sound of a spoon clinking against a cereal bowl, in the same story told for the 50th time, with just as much enthusiasm. And it isn't always easy. There are days of exhaustion, of frustration, of wishing things could be simpler. There are hospital visits, therapy sessions, hard conversations with educators, bureaucratic forms that never seem to end. But these are not the whole of the story. They are not even the heart of the story. The heart of the story is love, quiet, sturdy, unconditional, and that love does not flow in only one direction. It is not a gift given by the able to the disabled. It is reciprocal. It is mutual. It is surprising in its generosity. A young boy with Down syndrome, barely old enough to speak, notices his mother crying after a long day. He walks over, places his hand on her face, and simply stays there. He does not fix the problem. He does not offer solutions. He simply witnesses her sadness, and in doing so, lessens it. A teenager, watching her brother struggle with anxiety, wordlessly begins humming a tune they both love. No lecture, no instruction. Just a sound shared between hearts. These are not learned behaviors. They are instincts. They are expressions of emotional intelligence that rarely get measured, but often leave the deepest marks. And they remind us that connection is not a skill, it is a choice. One that can be made again and again, regardless of vocabulary, regardless of diagnosis. For siblings, the presence of a brother or sister with Down syndrome often reshapes their entire worldview. From a young age, they learn to navigate the world not only for themselves, but on behalf of someone else. They learn to advocate, to translate, to protect. But they also learn joy in unexpected places. They learn to find pride in their siblings' victories, to laugh at the same joke over and over, to accept imperfection not as a flaw, but as a fact of life. And as they grow older, many describe feeling a sense of gratitude for the empathy they've developed, for the community they've found, for the clarity of values that comes from knowing what really matters. Some go on to become special educators, therapists, doctors, lawyers. Others simply carry those lessons into whatever path they choose, becoming more thoughtful friends, more compassionate colleagues, more attentive parents. And in this way, the presence of one child with Down syndrome quietly alters the future of everyone they touch. Even strangers are not immune to this effect. A cashier at a grocery store remembers the customer who always insisted on stacking the items just right, who took longer at checkout, but always smiled so wide it felt like sunshine. A bus driver recalls the rider who sang softly to herself every morning, bringing a kind of calm to the otherwise hectic route. A dance instructor finds herself changed by a student who may not follow every move, but dances with such joy that the entire room begins to breathe differently. These small encounters add up. They ripple. They remind us that beauty does not always announce itself with grandeur. Sometimes it arrives in repetition, in predictability, in presence. And yet, the world does not always make space for this kind of presence. It rushes, it demands, it categorizes. It builds systems that reward speed, output, conformity. And so families of individuals with Down syndrome often find themselves in quiet resistance. They push back against timelines. They question norms. They ask, gently but persistently, for a different kind of measurement. Not just of progress, but of value. They say, let my child learn at their pace. Let them speak when they're ready. Let them be loved for who they are, not who you expect them to be. And over time, this resistance becomes a kind of culture, a way of life that centers humanity over hustle, relationship over results. Within this culture, joy is not a reward for achievement. It is a companion to being. It is found in routines that others might find monotonous. A favorite breakfast eaten every morning, a television show watched on loop, a walk taken on the same path every day. These repetitions are not limitations. They are anchors. They are ways of grounding in a world that often feels overwhelming. And when we learn to honor these rhythms, we begin to see them not as evidence of difference, but as invitations into a slower, deeper, more attentive way of living. There's a kind of wisdom that exists outside of language. It shows up in gestures, in timing, in presence. And many people with Down syndrome carry this wisdom instinctively. They understand when someone needs comfort. They recognize sincerity. They remember how you made them feel, even if they forget your name. And in this way, they hold up a mirror to the rest of us. They show us what we've forgotten. That it's okay to be excited about small things. That affection doesn't have to be earned. That time is not only valuable when it's productive. So as we continue telling this story, as we move through history and into the present, let us pause and acknowledge the quiet revolution unfolding around us. Not one of protest signs or sweeping legislation, though those have their place, but a revolution of being, of choosing to sit beside someone and learn their rhythm, of choosing to value slowness, of choosing to measure success not by what we accomplish, but by how we love. In a world that rewards noise, these lives whisper. And if we are wise, we will listen. Across the sweeping diversity of our planet, the experience of living with Down syndrome unfolds in vastly different ways, shaped not only by the extra chromosome that defines it medically, but also by the culture, geography, language, and social fabric that surrounds each individual. In some parts of the world, a diagnosis is met with swift support, early intervention specialists, inclusive classrooms, robust healthcare systems, and a cultural narrative that frames disability as a natural part of the human spectrum. In other places, the news arrives like a quiet storm, greeted with apprehension, wrapped in myths, or even shrouded in silence. In some families, the child is welcomed with warmth, with a network of relatives ready to adjust and rally. In others, the journey begins with isolation, with uncertain glances and whispered condolences, even though nothing has been lost. And yet, regardless of continent or custom, the underlying truth remains that love, when allowed to breathe, grows in the most unexpected soil. In nations with comprehensive social systems, children with Down syndrome are often enrolled in government-supported programs almost from birth. Physical therapy, speech-language services, occupational guidance, all coordinated in a way that helps parents feel less alone. Teachers receive training in adaptive strategies, and many schools offer inclusive models that place children with and without disabilities in the same classrooms, learning not only math and reading, but also empathy and patience. Representation in media becomes more common. Television shows feature characters with Down syndrome not as stereotypes or charity cases, but as multidimensional individuals with desires, opinions, and dreams. Policies like the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act in the United States, or similar frameworks in countries like Sweden and Canada, attempt to codify inclusion into law, turning what was once a matter of privilege into a matter of right. But even in these progressive environments, challenges persist. Parents still fight for resources. Bureaucracy can be slow, inconsistent. Social inclusion doesn't always mirror legal access. And the underlying work of shifting perception, the quiet labor of reshaping how people see difference, continues, often led by families, advocates, and the individuals themselves. In contrast, in areas with fewer resources or enduring cultural stigma, families often rely on improvisation and instinct. A mother in a rural village may never receive a formal diagnosis, only observing that her child is developing differently than others. A father may be told not to expect much, or worse, may be encouraged to institutionalize his son. In such regions, medical professionals might lack training, educational systems may be ill-equipped, and social attitudes may remain clouded by superstition or shame. And yet, even in these places, seeds of change take root. Community health workers begin to learn more. Nonprofits provide information, workshops, and support. Social media bridges the isolation, allowing a parent in Nigeria to connect with another in Argentina, both sharing a video of their child learning to tie a shoelace or pronounce a new word. The miracle of connection transcends language. A single image of a joyful child, arms wide open, smile unguarded, can undo years of silence. In cultures that embrace spiritual interpretations of disability, individuals with Down syndrome may be seen as sacred, closer to the divine, sent to teach others about compassion, humility, or joy. This can create a form of reverence, one that brings a sense of purpose and community. But it can also inadvertently strip the individual of their humanity, turning them into a symbol rather than recognizing their needs, their agency, their full range of emotions and complexities. In other settings, disability is still deeply misunderstood. It might be seen as a burden to be carried, a flaw to be hidden, or worse, a curse to be erased. In these narratives, the individual becomes invisible. Opportunities shrink, isolation deepens, and stigma grows stronger, passed quietly from generation to generation. And yet, no matter how entrenched the bias, it begins to shift the moment someone dares to ask a different question. Not what is wrong with this child, but what does this child need to thrive? Around the globe, stories of resilience continue to multiply. In Colombia, a bakery employs a team made entirely of individuals with Down syndrome, their hands shaping bread that nourishes both body and spirit. In Japan, a small village school adapts its curriculum to meet the pace and style of a new student, and in the process, discovers new methods that benefit all its learners. In New Zealand, an actress with Down syndrome performs to sold-out theaters, her talent undeniable, her presence transformative. In Turkey, a father organizes a music festival where his daughter can dance freely, surrounded by a community that once turned away. These moments are not confined to headlines or Instagram reels. They ripple outward, touching policies, altering perceptions, changing hearts. They challenge the notion that inclusion is a luxury. They insist that it is a necessity, a measure of a society's maturity. But even in these bright spots, hard truths remain. Prenatal testing has become more widespread and accurate in many countries, giving prospective parents more information earlier in pregnancy. For some, this leads to better preparation, more informed choices, and early bonding. But in other contexts, it results in termination rates that approach near totality, especially where fear, misinformation, or social pressure are strong. These are not decisions made lightly, and they exist in a complex web of ethics, emotion, and access. But the pattern reveals something troubling, that many people still equate disability with suffering, still assume that a life with Down syndrome is a life of limitation. And this misunderstanding, if unchallenged, becomes a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. We must ask, what if the suffering doesn't come from the condition itself, but from the way society responds to it? There is hope, and it often begins in the smallest acts. A bus driver who learns to wait an extra few seconds before pulling away. A nurse who greets a patient by name, not number. A teacher who sees potential rather than delay. A parent who chooses to celebrate rather than conceal. These gestures may seem minor, but they add up. They create momentum. They shift the baseline from tolerance to appreciation. They create space, not just for individuals with Down syndrome, but for all of us to be less hurried, more present, more human. And that, perhaps, is the quiet truth behind this global mosaic. That in learning how to include, we learn how to care. In learning how to listen, we learn how to grow. And in honoring those who are different from ourselves, we remember what connects us. Not chromosomes, not cognition, but love, curiosity, and the capacity to belong. At the heart of every discussion about Down syndrome lies a deeper question. What does it truly mean to be human? Not simply in the biological sense, but in the emotional, relational, and spiritual dimensions that shape our days and define our existence. This question, while philosophical, becomes sharply practical when seen through the eyes of a child who learns to speak a little later, or a teenager who struggles with reading, or an adult who dreams of holding a job and living independently. It is in these ordinary aspirations that we find the essence of inclusion, not in charity or sympathy, but in mutual recognition. Across countries and decades, the vision for people with Down syndrome has slowly evolved. Once seen as dependent, they are now increasingly viewed as contributors, not because they have changed, but because we have. We, as a global society, have begun to shift the lens, to recognize that ability is not one fixed line but a spectrum, and that dignity is not earned through productivity, but inherent in presence. And with that shift, new possibilities emerge. Consider the workplace. In a growing number of companies, employees with Down syndrome now participate in meaningful roles, whether greeting customers, organizing materials, stocking shelves, or managing tasks in creative industries. In coffee shops, bakeries, bookstores, and hotels, their contributions are not just tolerated but valued. Colleagues begin to see beyond the label. Customers notice something more than a difference. They sense authenticity. And that authenticity becomes contagious. It reminds others to slow down, to smile, to interact without pretense. In turn, managers begin to recognize something they hadn't expected. That hiring inclusively doesn't just benefit those with disabilities, it transforms workplace culture. It fosters patience. It reduces turnover. It encourages empathy. These lessons, while often framed as professional development, are really about returning to something essential: treating people as people. Education, too, becomes a frontier of transformation. Inclusive classrooms, when thoughtfully implemented, allow children with Down syndrome to learn alongside their peers, not in the margins, but as part of the shared journey. Teachers who once feared being unprepared find themselves adapting curriculum in ways that make learning better for everyone. A math lesson becomes more visual, a reading session more interactive, a science experiment more hands-on. In these adaptations, all students benefit. Beyond academics, inclusive settings nurture a kind of social intelligence that no textbook can teach: how to listen with care, how to communicate across differences, how to collaborate with patience. For the student with Down syndrome, the benefits are clear: exposure to higher expectations, opportunities to model peers, and a sense of belonging that no separate program can provide. For their classmates, The rewards are quieter but no less profound. They grow up knowing that diversity is not a problem to fix, but a fact of life to embrace. And yet, inclusion does not happen by accident. It requires intention. It requires investment. It requires a willingness to see potential before proof. Families are often the first to believe. They advocate tirelessly from school meetings to local councils, from hospital visits to political rallies. Their lives become a complex choreography of appointments, paperwork, and persistence. And still, they love. They laugh. They celebrate each step. A first word, a successful haircut, a solo trip to the store, milestones that might be taken for granted in other contexts become victories that ripple through entire households. These families are not saints. They are not heroes in the romantic sense. They are simply people who have learned to witness growth at a different tempo, to mark time in gestures rather than grades. And in doing so, they remind the rest of us that success need not be swift to be meaningful. Friendship, too, plays an irreplaceable role. For children and adults with Down syndrome, relationships outside the family real. Mutual friendships offer a chance to be known and accepted simply as oneself. These connections defy the transactional norms of so many social interactions. A friend who waits while words are found, who doesn't rush to correct or explain, who enjoys presence without pretense. Such a friend becomes a mirror in which the person with Down syndrome sees not their limits, but their light. And these friendships go both ways. They enrich the lives of those who receive as much as those who give. They teach that communication is not just about vocabulary, that affection does not always need articulation, and that loyalty often resides in the smallest gestures. A shared snack, a familiar joke, a gentle hand on the shoulder. In adulthood, autonomy becomes a central theme. Where once institutionalization was the default path, today there are increasing options for supported living, independent housing, and self-directed life planning. People with Down syndrome make choices about where to live, what to eat, how to spend their time. Some pursue romantic relationships, others explore faith communities, political causes, or creative pursuits. These lives are textured and varied. They are not without challenge, but they are also not without agency. With the right supports, independence becomes possible, not the kind of radical self-reliance often idolized in Western culture, but a balanced autonomy that includes interdependence, routine, and dignity. And in this model, we find a lesson for us all, that needing help does not mean lacking worth, and that community is not the absence of independence, but its foundation. Technology has also played a quiet revolution in this story. Tablets with speech apps, visual scheduling tools, wearable trackers, accessible messaging platforms. All of these innovations have opened new avenues for communication, organization, and safety. For individuals with Down syndrome, who often process information visually and benefit from structure, these tools offer more than convenience. They offer freedom. A young man can use an app to navigate a transit system. A woman can send voice messages to friends. A teenager can video chat with cousins across the globe, bridging both distance and delay. And as these tools become more user-friendly and affordable, their reach grows. Technology becomes not a barrier but a bridge, not a crutch but a catalyst. Beyond all the systems, policies, and tools, there remains a quieter dimension to this journey, the emotional landscape, the inner life. People with Down syndrome experience the full range of human feeling. They know frustration, excitement, jealousy, grief, pride, and longing. They reflect on their experiences. They form opinions. They ask questions that don't always have easy answers. To overlook this interiority is to flatten their humanity. It is to assume that outward difference implies inward simplicity, when in fact the opposite is often true. Many people with Down syndrome are remarkably attuned to the emotions of others. They read tone before text, sense discomfort before explanation. Their responses may be slower, but their perceptions are often sharper than we assume. And when given time, space, and respect, they express themselves in ways that are poignant, humorous, and utterly original. In the end, the question is not whether people with Down syndrome can participate in the world. The real question is whether the world is willing to make room for a broader definition of participation. Whether we, collectively, are ready to dismantle the barriers we've inherited, not just the physical ones, but the attitudinal ones, the assumptions cloaked in kindness, the ceilings disguised as care. Because the truth is, inclusion is not a matter of charity. It is a matter of justice. It is about recognizing that every person, regardless of chromosome count, has something to teach us, something to give us, something that completes us. And, in that recognition, we begin to write not just policies or plans, but stories. Stories of shared learning, shared laughter, shared life. The global story of Down syndrome is not only a story about individuals and their families. It is also a mirror held up to the values of entire societies. It reveals what we celebrate, what we fear, what we are willing to invest in, and what we still choose to ignore. In every town, every school, every home where a child with Down syndrome is born, a choice is made not just by the parents, but by the community, by the systems, by the culture itself. That choice is whether to include or exclude, to see that child as a gift or a burden, as a member or an outlier, as someone worthy of opportunity or someone destined for limits. And that choice, repeated countless times around the world, has shaped lives and legacies, dreams and disappointments, hopes and hesitations. It shapes the way children grow, the way parents advocate, the way teachers respond, and the way strangers either reach out or pull away. It shapes the future, not only of those born with Down syndrome, but of everyone who learns what kind of society they truly live in. When inclusion is chosen, it begins with small shifts. A teacher who rearranges her classroom so that a student in a wheelchair can move freely. A principal who ensures that assemblies are not overwhelming for students with sensory sensitivities. A librarian who adds picture-rich books with simplified language alongside classic literature. A dentist who trains in how to communicate with neurodiverse patients. A teenager who invites a classmate with Down syndrome to join a group project, not as an act of charity, but as a gesture of genuine friendship. These adjustments may seem minor, but they send a powerful message. You belong here. You are not an exception. You are expected. And with that message, the child begins to walk taller, to speak more freely, to participate with confidence. The effects ripple outward. Classmates learn to collaborate. Adults learn to listen. Communities learn to stretch, to adapt, to embrace. When exclusion is chosen, the opposite unfolds. Children are placed in separate classrooms, away from peers, away from conversations, away from the rhythm of daily school life. Their curriculum is reduced, their days become isolated, their milestones quietly overlooked. They may be cared for, but they are not included. They may be spoken about, but rarely spoken to. They may be present in the room, but absent from the story. And over time they begin to notice. The child who once waved eagerly starts to withdraw. The teenager who once tried to join the dance refuses to attend. The adult who once dreamed of work settles into silence. Not because they lost ability, but because they lost belief. Belief that they were welcome. Belief that they were seen. Belief that they mattered. This erosion does not happen all at once. It happens in small, avoidable, heartbreakingly preventable moments. And it happens not just to those with Down syndrome, but to all who are made to feel like guests in a space that should have been theirs all along. And so, inclusion must not be left to chance. It must be designed, nurtured, and protected. It must be woven into the very fabric of institutions, from policies to practices, from signage to staffing, from budgets to beliefs. It must be taught not just to professionals, but to peers, to parents, to the public. It must be framed not as an accommodation for a few, but as an enrichment for all. Because when inclusion becomes the norm, everyone benefits. Diversity in the classroom fosters better problem-solving skills. Mixed ability workplaces tend to have higher employee satisfaction. Public spaces that are accessible are more comfortable for everyone, not just those with disabilities. And societies that prioritize equity tend to have stronger civic trust. These are not abstract ideals. They are measurable realities, supported by research and affirmed by lived experience. But even more than that, inclusion reshapes the narrative of what is possible. It allows individuals with Down syndrome to imagine futures once denied them. Futures in which they live not on the margins, but in the middle of life. Futures where they are not just helped, but heard. Futures where they don't just receive, but contribute. This shift does not erase difficulty. It does not pretend that disability disappears. It acknowledges difference and meets it with creativity. It accepts limitation and answers it with support. It replaces pity with partnership, silence with storytelling, exclusion with belonging. And in doing so, it transforms not only the lives of those with Down syndrome, but the entire social contract. Because inclusion is not just about access. It is about attitude. It is about seeing a child and imagining not what they lack, but what they bring. It is about hearing a slower sentence and choosing to wait rather than interrupt. It is about celebrating a different rhythm of learning rather than forcing a one-size-fits-all model. It is about listening to what people need, not what we assume they want. It is about inviting everyone to the table, not because it looks good, but because it is right. And perhaps most profoundly, inclusion is about love, not the sentimental kind, but the courageous kind. The kind that acts. The kind that rearranges schedules, rewrites policies, reimagines spaces. The kind that insists, there is room. There's always room. In recent years, we have seen extraordinary examples of this courage. Countries that once institutionalized people with Down syndrome have begun to dismantle those systems and create alternatives based on supported living and community integration. Schools that once denied entry now create individualized plans and inclusive classrooms. Employers who once hesitated now champion diversity initiatives and mentorship programs. Public campaigns raise awareness with nuance and respect. Films and series feature actors with Down syndrome in complex roles. Athletes compete on national stages. Advocates speak at the United Nations. These moments matter. They do not erase pain, but they chart progress. They remind us how far we've come and how much more there is to do. They shine a light on what is possible when we stop asking, why, and start asking, how. Not why should we include, but how can we do it better? Not why make the effort, but how can we make it easier for all to belong? And perhaps the most powerful shift happens not in systems or stages, but in the quiet intimacy of everyday life. A brother who teaches his sibling how to ride a bike. A neighbor who always greets the young woman with Down syndrome by name, not out of obligation, but habit. A coach who modifies a drill so that everyone on the team can participate. A store clerk who speaks slowly, without condescension. A friend who learns sign language to deepen a conversation. These moments do not make headlines, but they make a world. They build relationships. They build resilience. They build the invisible network of dignity that holds people together. And over time, these small acts accumulate. They become culture. They become legacy. And so we find ourselves not at the end of a story, but in the middle of one. A story still being written, not by experts or officials, but by ordinary people making extraordinary choices. A story whose next chapter depends on what we believe about each other, and what we are willing to do about that belief. Will we choose ease or empathy? Will we cling to old myths or create new models? Will we speak up when inclusion is denied or stay silent? These are not abstract questions. They are the decisions that will determine whether the next generation of children with Down syndrome grows up in a world that truly sees them, hears them, and welcomes them not just in word but in deed, not just in policy but in practice, and not just as an obligation but as an opportunity to become better, kinder, more complete versions of ourselves. As we approach the final chapters of this reflection on Down syndrome, we return once more to the quiet truths that have threaded their way throughout every part of the story. The strength of families, the power of community, the quiet revolution of inclusion, and the enduring humanity of those born with a different genetic code. What began as a clinical observation more than a century ago has transformed into a movement, a mosaic, a global tapestry of lived experience, and it continues to unfold. In every corner of the world, new stories are being written every day. A mother in a small town guides her child's fingers through the motions of brushing teeth, patient and proud. A young man steps onto a stage for the first time, heart racing, voice steady as he delivers a speech about dreams and dignity. A teacher rearranges her classroom so that one more student can feel safe, can feel seen. A doctor reconsiders his language during consultations, choosing clarity and compassion over coldness and clinical terms. These moments might not seem revolutionary to an outside observer, but to the individuals living them, they are everything. They are the difference between isolation and inclusion, between silence and voice, between being accommodated and truly belonging. The journey is not easy. There are still obstacles, still misunderstandings, still moments of exhaustion, doubt, and grief. There are systems that remain rigid, services that are underfunded, environments that are still unwelcoming. There are people who turn away, still, clinging to outdated beliefs or shaped by fears they never thought to question. There are bureaucratic hurdles, long waiting lists, classrooms with too few aides, and employers who hesitate out of ignorance rather than ill intent. And yet, against all of this, families rise each day and choose hope. They write letters, they attend meetings. They advocate not just for their child, but for all children. They become the change-makers of policy and the architects of empathy. Their resilience is not born out of ease, but necessity. And their courage is not loud, but steadfast. In this long arc of change, language plays a critical role. The words we use to describe individuals with Down syndrome shape the way they are perceived, and ultimately, the way they are treated. Labels that once served as barriers, clinical terms used without thought, are slowly being replaced with people-first language with expressions of respect and recognition. Saying a person with Down syndrome instead of a Down syndrome person may seem small, but it places the humanity before the diagnosis. It reminds us that the individual is not defined by a condition, but enriched by a unique perspective. Even within media and art, representation is evolving. Characters with Down syndrome are being portrayed as full people, funny, flawed, curious, brave, unsure, determined. Not tokens, not plot devices, not background. They take center stage, not to inspire in a saccharine way, but simply to be seen as they are in their complexity and wholeness. And as culture shifts, so too do expectations. Where once parents may have been told not to expect much, they now receive messages of possibility. Possibility not as a promise of ease, but as a permission to dream. To plan for school not as a daycare, but as a place of learning. To imagine jobs not just as therapy goals, but as real employment. To think about relationships, about independent living, about travel, about art, about sports, not because these pursuits erase difficulty, but because they affirm life. This widening of expectation does not pressure individuals with Down syndrome to perform or to conform to narrow definitions of success. It simply allows space for more possibilities to emerge. It opens a window that was once shut. And through that window, fresh air begins to circulate. Technology, as mentioned before, continues to support these evolving dreams. But even more powerful than the tools themselves are the attitudes with which they are deployed. Technology in the hands of someone who sees potential becomes empowerment. Visual schedules, communication apps, reading support software. These do not replace human connection. They enhance it. They offer structure. They offer consistency. They offer autonomy. And when used thoughtfully, they become bridges, not barriers. It is easy, at times, to view inclusion as an ideal, something noble, yet out of reach, something aspirational rather than actual. But in truth, inclusion is already happening. It is happening in living rooms and playgrounds, in libraries and houses of worship, in offices and art studios. It is happening wherever someone is willing to ask, what will it take to make this space welcoming? And then actually listen to the answer. It is happening every time someone pauses, adapts, adjusts. Not because they have to, but because they want to. Because they see the value not only of the person they are including, but of the larger richness that inclusion brings. And once inclusion is experienced, it is rarely forgotten. It reshapes the mind. It softens the heart. It plants seeds that sprout into new ways of thinking, of teaching, of being. The future of individuals with Down syndrome will not be written by policies alone, though they matter. It will not be decided solely by medical advances, though they will continue to help. It will be shaped, above all, by relationships, by how we treat one another, by what we expect from each other, by the spaces we open and the assumptions we retire. It will be shaped by whether we are willing to see potential where once we saw limitation, whether we are willing to sit in discomfort until it becomes understanding, whether we are willing to share not just resources but respect. And perhaps most of all, it will be shaped by love, not romanticized love, not perfect love, but daily, persistent, imperfect, generous, ordinary love. The kind of love that wakes up each morning and tries again. That listens even when it's tired. That holds space even when it doesn't have answers. That celebrates not only milestones, but moments. As we near the end of this long reflection, one truth becomes clearer than ever. People with Down syndrome are not here to teach the rest of us lessons about joy or gratitude or simplicity, unless we are willing to first teach ourselves to truly see them. They do not exist to complete our narratives about hope or resilience or inspiration, unless we first complete our commitment to equality. They are not metaphors. They are people. They are sons and daughters, sisters and brothers, co-workers and classmates, artists and athletes, dreamers and doers. They are part of humanity's great mosaic, not on the edge, but in the center. And as with every member of that mosaic, their lives matter not because they are extraordinary, but because they are simply, profoundly human. In this, there is a quiet but powerful invitation to notice more, to judge less, to listen longer, to assume competence, to extend patience, to embrace complexity, to remember that we too are imperfect, and that our value lies not in flawlessness, but in connection. The story of Down syndrome, like so many stories, is still unfolding. And what comes next depends on us, on our choices, our courage, our willingness to reach across the invisible lines that divide. It depends on whether we see that our world is strongest, not when it is most efficient, but when it is most compassionate. That progress is not merely about speed or output, but about inclusion, dignity, and care. And that in choosing to create space for one more person, we do not lose anything. We gain everything. In the soft light of early morning, before the world begins its familiar hum, there are families around the globe starting their days in quiet, deliberate rhythm. A parent gently nudges a child awake, offering the same encouragement they've whispered for years. You can do this. Maybe it's a school day. Maybe it's work. Maybe it's a doctor's appointment, or a rehearsal, or a walk in the neighborhood. Whatever the destination, the journey begins with routines made sacred by repetition, tying shoes, checking the calendar, waiting for the bus. And for those living with Down syndrome, these small moments are never truly small. They are threaded with quiet victories. The brush of independence, the deep breath before stepping out, the trust that today will be another step forward, not backward. This is not a story of drama or spectacle. It's a story of steady progress, of effort that unfolds gently across days, weeks, years. The kind of effort that goes unnoticed unless you're looking closely. And the people who do notice, parents, teachers, caregivers, friends, become guardians of the story, bearing witness not to miracle, but to growth earned through patience, love, and time. The world outside doesn't always match that gentle rhythm. It moves fast, speaks loud, rewards quickness, multitasking, efficiency. In contrast, the pace of someone with Down syndrome might be slower, more deliberate, more sensory. But that pace reveals something the world often forgets, that presence matters more than performance. That laughter shared over breakfast, or time taken to notice the shape of a leaf, or the joyful ritual of greeting the same shopkeeper every morning are not detours from life, but life itself. In a culture obsessed with productivity, people with Down syndrome remind us that being is not less than doing. That joy is not a luxury. That connection is not secondary to success. And yet, to honor these values requires constant negotiation with systems that are not always built to accommodate them. At school, a student might flourish under a teacher who sees their strengths, who takes time to learn how they communicate, how they learn, how they shine. But that same student might struggle when shuffled between aides or placed in a curriculum designed for a different brain. The triumphs come not from singular effort, but from collaboration, a web of professionals and advocates and parents who believe in a bigger picture. And when it works, when inclusion is real, not just written in policy, the classroom becomes more than a space for learning. It becomes a space for transformation. Peers grow in compassion. Teachers grow in adaptability. Students with Down syndrome grow in confidence. And the entire room moves in rhythm toward a deeper kind of success, one that cannot be measured by test scores alone. In workplaces, similar patterns emerge. The hiring of a person with Down syndrome is not just a statement. It's a commitment. It means shifting training models, adjusting communication styles, and sometimes reimagining what a good employee looks like. It requires employers to understand that ability is not one size fits all, that contribution can be measured in many ways, in morale, in team cohesion, in customer relationships. And when done well, inclusion transforms not only the individual hired, but the entire work culture. A colleague becomes more patient. A manager becomes more creative. Customers feel something authentic. And the employee with Down syndrome gains more than a paycheck. They gain pride, identity, agency. But perhaps the most intimate spaces where inclusion lives or fails are the communities we inhabit daily. The parks, the places of worship, the libraries, the grocery stores. In these places, assumptions run deep. A child having a sensory overload might be met with stares instead of understanding. A young adult navigating the bus system might be dismissed instead of assisted. A man shopping with his caregiver might be spoken to indirectly as though invisible. And yet, these are precisely the moments where awareness becomes action, where a kind word, a patient pause, a willingness to listen can alter the trajectory of someone's day. Inclusion does not always require sweeping reform. Sometimes it's as simple as recognition of humanity, of effort, of presence. And while systems evolve slowly, individuals often lead the way. A sibling who grows up with a brother with Down syndrome learns early how to explain, how to defend, how to translate love into advocacy. These siblings, often unnoticed, carry both tenderness and fierceness. They become bridges, not only between their sibling and the world, but between outdated perceptions and new understandings. Their lives are shaped by a different kind of awareness, one that sees beauty in the nonverbal, resilience in the routine, humor in the unexpected. And for many, this experience becomes foundational. They become doctors, teachers, artists, social workers, professionals with empathy deeply ingrained. Romantic relationships also form part of this expanding landscape. Though still underrepresented, people with Down syndrome fall in love, date, marry. They express affection, navigate jealousy, set boundaries. They seek companionship just like anyone else. And while cultural narratives have long infantilized individuals with disabilities, this is changing. With the right support, with openness from families and communities, these relationships flourish. They remind us that emotional depth does not require cognitive complexity. That partnership is not about perfection, but mutual care. And in watching two people with Down syndrome hold hands at a community dance, or share a laugh on a bench, or argue gently over dinner, we see something universal, the longing to be loved, to be chosen, to be seen. Aging with Down syndrome brings its own set of experiences, often overlooked in mainstream discussions. Advances in medical care have increased life expectancy, and with that comes the need for systems that support older adults with Down syndrome. Health concerns like early onset Alzheimer's require attention. Social structures must adapt to meet changing needs. But alongside the challenges are deep wells of wisdom. Many older adults with Down syndrome carry decades of experience, jobs held, friendships built, routines mastered. Their faces tell stories not only of resilience, but of contribution. And as they age, their role shifts from being cared for to becoming elders, keepers of stories, teachers of patience, symbols of a life fully lived. In spiritual communities, inclusion takes on a sacred quality. Whether lighting a candle during service, singing in a choir, or simply being greeted with warmth, individuals with Down syndrome often find deep meaning in ritual, in rhythm, in belonging. Faith traditions, when inclusive, offer not only comfort, but identity. They affirm that worth is not earned, but inherent, that all are made in the image of the divine, and that in welcoming those once excluded, a community becomes more whole, not less. As we near the final steps of this reflection, we are reminded that the story of Down syndrome is not about overcoming, but about becoming. Becoming more human, more connected, more aware of the rich spectrum of ability and experience. It is about shifting from a world that asks, "What can you do?" to one that says, "You are welcome, exactly as you are." It is about creating systems that flex, not break, communities that adapt, not resist, and hearts that listen before judging. And in that listening, we discover not only the stories of others, but parts of ourselves we have forgotten, our need for slowness, for celebration, for compassion without conditions. As the journey through the world of Down syndrome nears its final reflection, we turn our gaze to the future, not with naive optimism, but with grounded hope shaped by all that has come before. Hope not as a soft wish, but as a steady resolve. Because everything we have seen, every classroom adapted, every job created, every friendship formed, every assumption challenged points not to a story of limits, but of expansion. Expansion of minds, of access, of compassion. It is not just people with Down syndrome who benefit when society becomes more inclusive. It is everyone. We all gain when empathy is a shared language. We all grow when patience becomes practice. We all thrive when we recognize the dignity of every person, regardless of diagnosis or difference. This is the heart of the story, not charity, not sacrifice, but shared humanity. And the question that now rests gently in the air is this: what comes next? In many ways, the future begins with how we raise the next generation. What books we read to children, what shows they watch, what friendships they are encouraged to build. When children see characters with Down syndrome on screen, not as comic relief or pity projects, but as full people, they internalize a truth. Difference is not dangerous. It is simply different. And when parents model acceptance, when they answer questions with honesty and kindness, when they include children with Down syndrome in birthday parties and soccer games and study groups, they shape a worldview that resists fear. In these early years, bias can be softened before it hardens. Stereotypes can be rewritten before they take root. And it is in these small, everyday choices that culture begins to shift, not in headlines, but in hearts. Technology, which has always been a tool shaped by intent, also plays a role in this unfolding future. Innovations in communication devices, in learning platforms, in job training modules are opening doors that once seemed permanently shut. With voice-assisted apps, someone who struggles with verbal speech can order a coffee, direct a taxi, or greet a friend. With tailored learning software, abstract concepts can be broken down visually, turning frustration into understanding. With job-specific simulations, workplace readiness is no longer an abstract dream, but a step-by-step reality. But these tools alone are not enough. They must be paired with belief, with training for staff, with policies that protect, with cultures that welcome. Because technology, for all its brilliance, cannot substitute for belonging, and belonging remains the thread that ties every chapter together. To belong is to be missed when absent, to be heard when quiet, to be included even when one's pace is slower or needs are different. Belonging is not about fitting in. It is about being embraced as you are. In schools, this means more than just placement. It means participation, presence, potential. In workplaces, it means meaningful roles, respectful support, and fair compensation. In communities, it means access, not just physical access, but emotional access. Can someone with Down syndrome enter a space and feel at home? Not tolerated, not accommodated, but welcomed? That is the question every institution must ask itself as we move forward. Policy will continue to shape this future, of course. Legislation matters, funding matters, training and accountability matter. But culture often moves before law does, and hearts often change before policies do. Advocacy, then, must be both outward and inward. It must demand better services, yes, but it must also invite better stories. It must share not only data, but narrative. It must highlight not only barriers, but breakthroughs. And it must center the voices of those most affected. Self-advocates with Down syndrome are already leading this charge, speaking at conferences, testifying before governments, writing books, starring in films, mentoring younger peers. Their presence is not symbolic. It is essential. Because no story about Down syndrome is complete without the perspective of those living it. And their stories, like all human stories, are not tidy. They contain contradictions, complexities, celebrations, setbacks. They contain moments of laughter so pure it echoes through memory, and moments of grief so quiet it almost goes unnoticed. They contain the mundane and the miraculous, the grocery lists and the graduation speeches, the hospital stays and the holiday traditions. And it is in this full spectrum that dignity resides, not in perfection, but in personhood. A young woman with Down syndrome walking confidently through a crowded train station on her way to work. A boy who learns to tie his shoes after months of trying. A father who finally hears his daughter say, "I love you." These are not exceptions. These are realities. And they deserve to be seen not with surprise, but with recognition. In the end, what we choose to see will shape what we choose to build. If we see only difference, we will build walls. If we see only difficulty, we will build barriers. But if we see humanity shared, imperfect, beautiful in its diversity, we will build bridges. We will build ramps, yes, but we will also build relationships. We will build systems that adapt instead of demand. We will build a world where slowing down is not punished, where help is offered without hesitation, where joy is taken seriously. And in this world, people with Down syndrome will not just survive, they will thrive. Not despite their differences, but in the richness of them. So what comes next is not a conclusion, but a continuation. It is the next meeting, the next story, the next opportunity to say, you belong here. It is in the questions we ask our leaders. It is in the policies we advocate for. It is in the empathy we extend to strangers. It is in the ways we teach our children. And it is in the still soft promise we make to one another that no one is too different to matter, too complicated to care for, too slow to keep up, too disabled to be dignified. That all of us, in our different shapes and sizes and abilities, are part of this great unfolding human story. And that story is better, so much better, when everyone gets to speak. And so, in the quiet that follows, we are left not with answers, but with awareness. Awareness that each life, regardless of how it begins or what challenges it carries, is worthy of space, of celebration, of belonging. We have wandered through homes and schools, workplaces and memories, futures imagined, and friendships real. And in each place, we found not a story about a condition, but a story about connection. If you carry anything forward, let it be this: that even the gentlest lives leave lasting marks. That compassion is never wasted. That the world becomes softer, kinder, more awake when we choose to make room for everyone, just as they are. Close your eyes now. Let the echoes of these voices stay with you. Let them settle like stars across your thoughts. And let sleep come gently, carrying the truth that in a world of noise, inclusion is a lullaby worth singing again and again.